So, is Grand Seiko really different from Seiko? Huh. What's up guys, it's your boy Rich here. So I thought we'd talk about, is Grand Seiko truly independent from Seiko? In 2017, Grand Seiko declared themselves as being truly independent from Seiko, and they showed this largely by eliminating the dual dial where it said Seiko and Grand Seiko. Seiko used to be across the top of the dial and Grand Seiko used to be at 6 o'clock. Now the newer dials simply say Grand Seiko. I do like that look. I think it is a much cleaner look. So is that all that Grand Seiko did to distinguish themselves from Seiko, or do they actually have to do anything more? Well, part of the fun debate is if we accept Tudor as being truly independent from Rolex, because Tudor is also owned by Rolex, then we might have to feel the same way about Grand Seiko, though the differences are a little bit different between Rolex and Tudor and Seiko and Grand Seiko. So let's start with the facilities between Seiko and Grand Seiko. They do not use the same facilities or same building when they make their watches. They're in completely different buildings, nor do they share the same staff nor the parts. Grand Seiko only uses their in-house products, including their crystals that they grow in-house. So, for example, if a Grand Seiko watchmaker calls out sick, they cannot simply call in a Seiko watchmaker, even though those who work on the higher-end Seikos to come work for Grand Seiko for a day or two. Grand Seikos are only made by specific Grand Seiko watchmakers. Grand Seiko has their own QC team or quality control team that inspects every Grand Seiko before they get released, versus Tudor and Rolex, who actually share the same quality control team in the same space. And part of my self-imagined argument that I used to concoct to convince myself that a brand is truly independent from a division was if both brands actually had two different management teams. So for example, if Seiko had its own CEO and president, and Grand Seiko had its own CEO and president, and there's been no indication of this, nor has this happened in the past. For example, if Grand Seiko sales started to decline significantly, I always felt that it would be less likely for the CEO of Grand Seiko to be able to double dip into Seiko's more affordable parts. But the reason I no longer feel this way after overanalyzing everything is because Seiko is still a family-run business, ultimately ruled by Shinji Hattori. So in this case, Mr. Hattori could simply fire off a memo to the CEO of Seiko instructing them to provide Grand Seiko with the cheaper parts. So for this reason, my self-concocted imagination doesn't carry any merit. So if we go back to the Tudor and Rolex scenario, I think there are parallels between Tudor and Rolex and Seiko and Grand Seiko, but it's worth noting that the Rolex diehards refuse to accept that with Tudor and often refer to Tudor as the poor man's Rolex. This is in sharp contrast to Seiko and Grand Seiko, because in this case, it is the Seiko diehards who refer to Grand Seiko as just a glorified Seiko, versus the more expensive Grand Seiko line turning their nose up to Seiko. So while Grand Seiko and Seiko don't have their own management teams, Grand Seiko does go a little further out of their way because they do have their own team that is responsible for the US distribution, or in North America. And interestingly, in the Seiko boutiques, or what they call Seiko Luxe, meaning they carry Seikos that are $500 on up alongside Grand Seikos, those who sell the Grand Seikos are technically not employed by Seiko. They are employed by Grand Seiko. I just don't know if that means their paychecks are signed by Grand Seiko, but that's worth noting. Will the future of this type of distinction between Seiko and Grand Seiko continue in the US? It might continue along this vein, but I don't ever see Grand Seiko and Seiko actually having their own management teams in Japan. But in the US, they might have to have a US division that is a little bit different. So do I think Grand Seiko is truly independent from Seiko in terms of looks and quality? I do. And when I bought my Seiko Grand Seiko, I always knew that the craftsmanship and quality was unparalleled to any Seiko model, including the so-called Seiko Baby Grand Seikos. And for that matter, most other watches as well. Yes, Grand Seiko is independent from Seiko, much the same way that Tudor is to Rolex, and I might argue with a little more distance between them. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you the next time. Part of my even the so-called Seiko Baby Grand Pianos, no. ultimately run by Shinji Hattori. Good job, Rich.